Thank you so much for tuning in for the second daily roundup from the 2021 Borlaug Dialogue. To discuss highlights and takeaways from today's sessions, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Shachi Gurumayum, Head of Business Development at AgBiTech and co-founder of the Malkeki Foundation. So many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Pontus. It's a pleasure. And it's been a wonderful, exciting, long day, I have to say.
If we start by diving into the roundtable of the day on gender equity and equitable livelihoods, what were some of your key takeaways from that session?
Right. We had a very diverse, very strong, a number of panelists. It was quite an exciting session, roundtable, to be honest. I mean, we got started with Jemina from IFPRI talking about, who was based in Kenya, talking about the 4 domains to cover, how do you increase women's voice, women's participation in all of this, and then secondly, how do you shift resources? How do you design, gender responsive budgets, for example? How do you make national food systems cohesive with the gender policy? So kind of focusing on the policy side. And then she, as a 4th domain, she mentioned about, the underlying gender and social norms that sort of prohibit women from participating more or being recognized in the agricultural domain, but I guess it also extends to other sectors as well. So, the way she put it was, we need to work for women as they are working for us, to make this more inclusive model. I mean, we also had a lot of talk about data. I mean, Garrett from World Fish talked about how we need to have more data to make, the contribution of women to the economy more visible and use that to empower, argue the case for women's empowerment, and the fact that, men need to be part of this change. Men at leadership positions need to recognize that there is a need to drive this. Of course, Jocelyn from the FAO talked about how, we need to think about a global overarching ideas coming from the UN and the FAO, but we need to have local systems that work. Nabisa from PAI, spoke about how COVID has disproportionately impacted women through, domestic violence and access to reproductive health care and so on, and something that I think is very close to her heart and what they're doing at PAI. USDA was represented by Jenny. I understand, and I was quite impressed, first Native American woman to be the general counsel at USDA, I understand. So she was setting an example for all of us in that sense. And she talked about how her own personal experience shaped her career and how, she's working on indigenous rights. And so I think this is important because as you look around the world, we need to think about women, but then women in indigenous communities, and how does that, how do we bring that into the food systems main fold? Chris from CFS again, and then Beth from the African Development Bank, talking about what the bank has been doing. So what kind of programs do they have? And she talked about a couple of them, in order to help women access finance technology. There's the one that she mentioned was Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, AFAWA. And then there's another program that I am aware of because we've been, as AgBiTech, we've been part of this. It's called the Technology for African Agricultural Transformation, TAT. So these are things that are helping to not only increase access to finance, but also technology, and climate smart agriculture. How do you make sure that farmers are addressing some of the key global concerns that we have? The interesting one, from a farmer educated in California, but back in India now farming, was agri-rural tourism. This is a way to get people to come to the farm where, women are the main workers. And Shekhar was talking about how this not only empowers women economically because they're getting an income, but it also gives them dignity and confidence, critical in being able to stand up for themselves on their own 2 feet. And so this connectivity between urban folks coming to rural farms. I think, yeah, that's kind of the gender section, I mean, I personally said, you know, what we need to think about along 3 lines to maybe wrap it up with my own thoughts. Well, the first one was, when we think about, you know, gender equality and equitable livelihoods, we need to think about a gender sensitive design with an inclusive mindset from the very beginning, before you even start the work. You know, as you're designing, incorporate all of these elements and make sure that it's implemented. Of course, there's the policy and what, you know, as you saw from yesterday's interview in the wrap up with Lady Agri, what they're doing is a group that I advise, and they're trying to make a lot of transformative programs in emerging markets, especially Africa. So it's worth understanding what they're doing in terms of making, you know, finance accessible. It was interesting. A bet from the AFDB said, you know, it's one thing to make a woman bankable. What we need to think about is how to make banks womanable. So I thought that was a catchy line. And yeah, the last bit is capacity building. That's, you know, my thought process that, you know, farms managed by women based on statistical data are 40–50% lower in yield. And the reason for that is women just haven't had the access to, you know, the training, the kind of tools that are out there. And I think we need to accelerate that for to have this equity.
Perfect. That's perfect. That's a really comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. And it was, like you said, it was a very catchy term, to make banks womanable. That was something that stood out. So if we move on to the next session, where we heard from the 2021 World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Shakuntala tilsten. What were some of your insights or takeaways from that session?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a father to 2 girls, I mean, and also of Asian origin, right? I grew up in India, in Manipur, where the Malkeki Foundation is. I think, and she said this herself with the sheer number of messages that she's been getting, she is a role model. And she, I think a lot of people are encouraged by her success to do more and to do better. And I thought that was, you know, if anything, that was a really strong message to get out of that session. I know we were talking about, you know, aquatic foods and so on, what she calls superfoods here, that it can address child growth and development and so on. But I think besides the work on aquatic foods and what she's done, I think what is also important is her, you know, being there as a role model for a lot of young women and girls around the world. I think she said something that kind of, as a piece of advice towards the end, she said, you must work hard. And I agree. But even my dad said, you know, there's no alternative to hard work. You work hard first. And then she said, you must have interest, which is true, you know, focus and interest, and must have mentors. This is quite interesting, you know, when you talk about careers, and it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. I think you do need to have somebody, as you put it, you must have people who can help you get across. I think these are some very good advice beyond the sort of work interest that she was talking about in low and middle income countries, and how, you know, aquatic food can support growth and development of children. So yeah, inspiring.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for that. And if we then move on to the session on the silent threat of AMR, or antimicrobial resistance.
I mean, I have to say, I learned quite a few new things. I mean, I was aware of AMR, you know, antimicrobial resistance. You know, as someone working in the agricultural sector, you do come across it. As Dame Sally Davis called it, you know, the silent pandemic that we all need to talk more about, spread the word. And I understand now why. Apparently 80% of antibiotics that we use is in farming. And if I got the numbers right, 90% of what's consumed is excreted, and therefore that enters into our land and water and our ecosystem. And one of the other speakers said, you know, by 2020, the estimate is that there'll be $100 trillion in costs from 10 million deaths per annum. And it is quite important to sort of understand this context, and also realize that this has a significant impact. And that's why the silent pandemic, because, you know, it is at the scale of a pandemic, and yet we don't seem to know enough about it. And so how are we going to manage this? I mean, of course, a lot of people, a lot of the, in fact, all of them talked about One Health, approaching human health and animal health together. This concept of One Health, managing the risk and addressing some of the causes, people mixing medication into the animal feed with bare hands and so on. There were many examples of how, what causes this and so on. So there you go, spreading the word. And I think everyone needs to be aware of it.
Exactly. Awareness is the first step. Thank you. And then if we move on to the final session where were the North American government agricultural leaders, what were some of your comments and insights from there?
Yeah, I mean, this one was interesting with Minister Vivo from Canada, the agricultural, Honorable Minister of Agriculture from Canada, obviously Secretary Vilsack from the US, and then Secretary Villalobos from Mexico, and moderated by Barbara. So what was interesting for me was, I think if anything, COVID and the scale of its impact has made everybody recognize that we need to, has helped us to put things in context. And we talk about how it has impacted a lot of people, millions around the world, okay, more specifically here in North America, but its impact is global, how it has increased food insecurity. And in the middle of all this, Canada has had, for example, droughts, wildfire, Mexico, same thing, and so we've had a lot of challenges that have come at the same time. I think it's made people sit up and say, we need to do something together. And what is that, and how are we going to do it? Of course, we talked about innovative solutions and the innovations that these countries are working on. But before I come to the specific example, I think some of the areas where they all agreed was on the how, as three big countries in North America and in many ways, the relations between those countries, USA, Canada, and Mexico, kind of set examples for other countries around the world, other regions around the world. So they all recognize that, and they said, we need more collaboration, we need more communication, whether it's amongst the country's leaders, or within the country amongst its researchers, or transnational. So set up platforms for that, make models more inclusive, bring in women, youth, indigenous populations. And set the example. That's what they looked at. Now, in terms of innovation, I was quite impressed. I mean, all of them had very high, had set very ambitious targets. So when I look at this, let me just look at my notes. Yeah. So, obviously, apparently Canada's had its first ever food policy, something called the On-Farm Climate Action Plan as well, which talks about nutrient management, rotational grazing, and so on. And they've had, interestingly, it rhymes a little bit with what we talked about in the gender roundtable, where we were talking about connecting players in the food system. So Canada has something called the Living Labs, where they bring scientists to the farm and increase this engagement. Because whatever you want to do, if you don't have farmers on board, you will struggle. So you need that buy-in from the farmers to have that transformation. For the US, I mean, Secretary Vilsack talked about the vision of net zero agriculture by 2050, and that's President Biden's vision. And I think he spoke about how this is important in driving the rest of the agenda, and how, the country is trying to move from extractive from an extractive economy, which is how the US, built its power and influence, to a circular economy. How do you make this more sustainable? And then coming last but not the least to the example from Mexico. One of the examples we heard from Secretary Villalobos was something called Mas Agro that they have in, I think it's a CIMMYT-led initiative in Mexico, where interestingly, they recognize that, in a year when I understand the economy has been down 8%, but ag has gone up 2%. And he believes that part of the reason is because they have a combination of natural traditional practices with some of the modern tools that are available to Mexican farmers. I think, yeah, all in all, pretty exciting discussion. And of course, when asked to wrap up, and this is kind of what I also want to say, I mean, we've had a whole lot of discussions, some up there, some really to the ground, and I think the key thing, as Secretary Villalobos said, is at the end of the day, we need to take it to the farmer, which is what Norman Borlaug would have said, and would have said even after listening to today's sessions, I say. Thank you.
Great. That's a great takeaway, I think. So thank you so much for joining us today. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and to get your insights on today's session. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Pontus. Pleasure. Bye.